It's great to be in a room with this much intellectual horsepower. I'm going to talk about trait signaling, how we show off the traits that we have, particularly mental and moral traits, and the way that that drives a lot of economic and consumer behavior. So, life evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. Sex evolved about 1.2 billion years ago, bacteria exchanging genes, and that helped accelerate evolution a little bit. But things didn't really get very exciting in terms of multicellular animals until this point. About 543 million years ago, eyes evolved, and the lights went on in the world, and animals could finally see predators and prey and conspecifics, and perhaps most importantly, potential mates. And one leading theory about the Cambrian explosion, the amazing diversification of life forms right around this period, is that once you have a distance sense where you can evaluate potential mates with regard to their visual appearance, their symmetry, complexity, coloration, that can favor a very rapid diversification of these different product categories, these life forms. And so you go from 3 to 38 major animal phyla within just 5 million years. And that represents a kind of big bang of biodiversity. And I think it's quite likely that it was driven by the evolution of vision. So ever since then, evolution's been driven along by two different complementary processes. One is natural selection for efficient survival at the individual and group levels, but also social and sexual selection for various kinds of conspicuous signals where animals are showing off their good genes, good health, good behavior to other animals, either to intimidate them or attract them. And you can see this in all kinds of forms, both morphological and behavioral. The palps of the mantis shrimp, which has 16 different kinds of photoreceptor cones, apparently. The tails of the guppy fish. Also behaviorally, the call of the Tungara frog. Face of the mandrill. Once you get primates with color vision, you get biodiversity in terms of facial coloration. The peacock's tail, the bower bird, building an elaborate bower, animal architecture, decorating it with berries, shells, plants, etc. And also at the human level, the use of red ochre as body pigment and hair ornamentation for at least 100,000 years. The evolution of morphological signals like big upper body muscles in males, or breasts and buttocks in females, and the development of things like cave paintings. These can all be pretty well understood by a combination of sexual selection theory and signaling theory. And I've spent most of my career, the last 20 years, as an evolutionary psychologist trying to understand which human mental traits may have also evolved partly through sexual selection and or social selection. So there's some truly puzzling mental traits that we have that Darwin paid quite a bit of attention to that seem mostly ornamental, i.e. mostly irrelevant to survival, where the attempts by psychologists, anthropologists, archaeologists to say, yeah, here's a plausible survival payoff for music, those theories have generally fallen flat. And these have proven quite recalcitrant to explanation in terms of survival value. But they are highly romantically attractive. And if you read singles ads or watch what happens in places where people are on the mating market, this is where this happens. And this is why teenagers become obsessed with building their skills in these areas: creativity, music, art, humor, and even showing off good mood or happiness. Happiness itself, in my view, is not so much a response to incoming utility, as economists think, but it's a conspicuous signal of mental health to others. And then there's a whole bunch of traits where they look kind of half practical, where you can come up with a survival story that goes part of the way, but they're also half ornamental. They're still romantically attractive and socially impressive. And those include things like intelligence, language, mental health, social status, material wealth, and moral virtues. Right, where you can spin some stories about how these promote individual or group survival, but also they seem to function often as signals. So how does this relate to business or consumer behavior? I think What people call consumer behavior on the metaphor of animals consuming food, that's actually very often a misleading metaphor for what consumption really is. It's not like hyenas eating the heads of animals. It's not even like Eva Mendes, looking at her magnum in a sort of pre-orgasmic phase of excitement. It's more like what the superb bird of paradise is doing to impress the female. Here's a female, there's the male, there's the male's head, this is his tail fully displayed. Choices by her female ancestors have transformed his body from an ordinary bird-looking body into psychedelic smiley face, right, to advertise his genes. And that's the power of sexual selection. He's a walking, singing advertisement for his genetic quality. And by analogy, a lot of conspicuous consumption, going all the way back to Veblen, 1898, seems to be more about signaling than about really enjoying it or eating it. Right, so the Bugatti Veyron, the 1,001 horsepower car with 16 cylinders, it costs $1.2 million and goes 267 miles per hour. You don't really need that, right, at a practical level, but it's a really impressive signal. And indeed, in our little field of evolutionary consumer psychology, there's quite a lot of evidence accumulating now that a lot of conspicuous consumption does seem to function implicitly or unconsciously as sexual signaling in a mating market. And it has been always thus, all the way back to the Art Nouveau posters advertising absinthe, to the current BMW posters, and the sort of globalization of consumption, where here the Maoists have gotten very excited about their Samsung Galaxy S5s that are coming out. So you can do studies where you give people mating primes, think about a courtship situation. Think about what a first date with an attractive, intelligent person would be like, right? Think about that as opposed to think about greenery or dogs or a nice office environment. Well, if you give people the mating primes, men are more motivated to get luxury goods, but women don't really care. They want to do conspicuous charity instead of conspicuous consumption. People will volunteer more time and money for charity. They're becoming more pro-social. They're advertising the moral virtues. They can identify luxury goods and brands and logos more quickly in a visual array if you make them think about mating first. They seek more product diversity and uniqueness rather than conformist tastes. And you see more financial risk-taking in single men, but less in married men. And that has interesting implications in behavioral finance, where depending on your risk profile, you want to get your hedge fund manager either when he's single or when he's married. It matters. I've shown men give higher tips to ovulating lap dancers, which is not terribly relevant, but it's kind of interesting. And there's also evidence that short-term mating effort, your interest in promiscuous mating, does predict conspicuous consumption investment and materialistic attitudes. And women interpret male conspicuous consumption as a signal that he's after a short-term mate. He's not interested in settling down yet. Also, Vlad Griskevicius, who's done great work in this area, has shown that where there's a local scarcity of women, in particular American cities, men tend to spend more, they accumulate more consumer debt, more credit card debt, they do more conspicuous consumption because the male-to-female ratio is adverse and the males have to compete more. In New York, it's sort of the opposite effect. So there's a lot of evidence that conspicuous consumption does function as sexual signaling. And of course, the traditional American meritocracy flowchart, right? This is the American dream. This is how you achieve social and economic and reproductive success, at least in 20th century America, follows this kind of logic, right? Hopefully you're born with good genes. That's the major stroke of luck. That's a lot more important than having a good family environment. You get standardized testing, and that lets you enter the cognitive meritocracy based on your SAT scores. That lets you achieve certain educational credentials, which are costly and wasteful. That leads you to get skilled employment in certain cool places that let you have dogs. And then that promotes workaholic careerism and delayed reproduction. Then you're supposed to take all the money that you earn and spend it on runaway consumerism, which is promoted by marketing. And if you do enough runaway consumerism, then eventually around age 60 or 70 or something, you're supposed to finally attract friends and mates and have babies, and they have genes, and so the cycle continues. And, you know, sitting on my granddad's knee, he was a marketing professor, he basically said, grandson, this is how you succeed in America. This is what you do. And so I tried, except I didn't get hired there. The problem from an evolutionary psychology point of view is that that kind of cognitive meritocracy is fairly new and fairly artificial. And it doesn't really fit that well with any plausible display instincts that we would have had. It's another case of possible mismatch, as Stephen mentioned. Could gene-culture coevolution really work fast enough to have favored instincts for displaying monetary wealth and elite taste in modern societies? I think to some degree maybe, but not very deeply, right? We've been social primates for 30 million years with local status hierarchies. We've been hunter-gatherers for at least 2 million years, hyper-social primates. We've only had wealth and elites for about 10,000 years. Trade might go farther back, but in terms of hierarchical stratified societies with inherited wealth and complex ornamentation and architecture, that's all fairly recent. So it seems fairly implausible that we would have deep instincts for either acquiring money per se or displaying it through conspicuous consumption. So what are we doing in modern consumerism? What traits are we advertising? I would argue that far deeper than monetary wealth or elite taste, these central 6 mental traits are worth signaling and have been worth signaling to other humans for a very long time. And those central 6 are general intelligence, or good old-fashioned IQ, and the so-called big 5 personality traits: openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, stability, and extraversion. More on those later. Why are these important? Because you can find them in all the great apes. They can be rated reliably in orangutans, gorillas, bonobos, and chimps. So they seem to all be at least maybe 5 or 8 million years old. They're all genetically heritable, as we know from twin and adoption and GCTA genetic studies. They're stable across life, relatively stable. You can find them in all cultures. They're attractive to mates, friends, and kin. They're rated spontaneously, even if they're not given these trait names. And we judge them fairly accurately and quickly in a few minutes of face-to-face conversation. So they're important. How do we demonstrate them? Well, I think a lot of what's going on with brand differentiation and the match between consumer personality and brand personality is that brands are actually positioning themselves as displays of these traits rather than just of monetary wealth. So for example, if you want to show off your high intelligence, that you're up here on the bell curve around 130 rather than down here mentally retarded, you buy anything labeled smart, right? Smart food, smart water, smart cars. You do leisure activities that are intellectually demanding, like learning Mandarin Chinese as an adult. You master sophisticated technologies like smartphones that people down here simply couldn't figure out and show off that you're using them. You do things that are dangerous if you were stupid, like flying airplanes, or you get educational credentials. At the other extreme, it's not that people consciously signal, I'm not very bright, but they leak cues of stupidity accidentally, right? So you're on the 3rd date, you go home with a woman, she's got Astrology for Dummies on the bookshelf. Your estimate of her intelligence goes, right? Or even worse, if she's got homeopathic care for cats and dogs. Homeopathy doesn't work. It especially doesn't. Placebo effects don't work for cats or dogs. That's a big fail. Right? And I don't have time to go through all 6 traits, but maybe I'll do like 2 more. Openness to experience, interest in aesthetics, these are important, and you can signal them basically by being an investor in weird contemporary art. The $100 billion of brand equity that Apple has built up is basically Apple has positioned itself as a conspicuous signal of openness, right? Interest in design and aesthetics. That's its brand equity. Interest in alternative music, alternative fashion, alternative medicine, these are openness indicators. Openness is a great market niche to be in because the open are often highly gullible and will pay a price premium for things that are new and different even if they don't work. And foreign travel is also a major route for displaying your openness because conservatives in red states just can't stand to do foreign travel. It's too weird to them and threatening. And you can run through the other central 6 traits in terms of how they're displayed, like credit scores and pension savings to show off conscientiousness, gift giving, dinner parties, taking care of pets, spoiling your kids to show off agreeableness. Of course, the psychopaths down here like to show off I'm disagreeable because it's a credible threat. Stability, extraversion, okay. So, last 2 slides before we get to questions. The problem with runaway consumerism and this style of displaying your traits to others is that it has some costs often. A lot of these ways of showing off your mental traits, as we've seen this morning, impose a lot of negative externalities on other people and animals and the environment. It often creates a situation where sociopaths flourish if wealth and taste are sort of idolized too much. It creates political systems where corporate plutocracy or kleptocracy sort of dominate the political system. It leads to focusing on GDP per capita as the goal of social policy, even though you get diminishing marginal returns as wealth increases, happiness reaches a plateau after a certain point. When you have runaway credentialism, workaholic careerism, and runaway consumerism, that leads to delayed reproduction, delayed marriage, and often infertility problems and demographic crashes. And also in terms of mental health, it leads to a lot of alienation, where people are not happy with the work, buy, consume, die lifestyle. So the question for us, last slide, is in terms of ethical systems design, not just how do you promote mutually beneficial gains from trade, but how do you design ways for people to show off their traits to others, which I think is a major life goal that we have. How do you show off your traits in ways that are more sustainable, socially or ecologically? Well, we have some good ideas on the table, right? Bob Frank has argued for consumption taxes, which could shift a lot of money away from consumption towards investment or charity. Green consumerism is very much a new way of displaying agreeableness and conscientiousness through your product choices rather than just your wealth. Socially responsible investing or impact investing is another way to show off conscientiousness, agreeableness, openness. Doing evidence-based charity, where instead of just burning money in public in ways that look altruistic but don't actually do any good, right? You go to websites like GiveWell and figure out where do I actually get the most bang for my buck. And that is sort of the converse. Instead of just signaling agreeableness, you're also signaling intelligence, right? Are you doing bright charity rather than just throwing money at problems? A lot of people now are doing virtual consumption. You can buy a really cool house in Second Life for about 50 bucks, right? That would cost $5 million in real life. And a lot of people are doing this, designing their own stuff in virtual environments where they can show off their mental traits without actually having the money. In terms of opting out of that American dream system, the cognitive meritocracy, a lot of people are figuring out, hey, I can show off my intelligence and my big 5 personality traits directly to mates and friends through Facebook and YouTube and Twitter without having to get educational credentials or a profession or consumerism. And finally, with the rise of Google Glass and augmented reality, we've got the potential now to overlay digital information on the real world and to have new ways of figuring out what traits do you have that are kind of mediated through various digital clearinghouses. Like I could actually see how much money is in your bank if you're willing to display that information to my Google Glass. And you don't even have to buy the suit. You could wear whatever you want, as long as I can see credible, validated information about who you are and what your traits are. Okay, I'll stop there and take questions.